So welcome everyone to the May Friends of the Egypt Centre lecture. I know that there's a lot of members in the audience today, as well as people who are joining us who haven't been on our events before. So thank you to everybody who is supporting the Egypt Centre with these events. I'll be chairing the lecture tonight, and Sam, my co-chair, will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any technical problems or any questions, then you can post them into the chat. We will disable the chat itself during the lecture just to avoid any distractions, but you'll still be able to send the questions through to the hosts and co-hosts. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Olga Saplechnyuk, who holds a PhD in history at the Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University in Ukraine. Olga is a PhD candidate in Egyptology at Swansea University, and she arrived to Swansea pretty much at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So the timing was very unfortunate for Olga, as she was stuck at home for almost a year and a half without interacting with other students. But since the lockdown has ended, she has been a volunteer at the Egypt Centre, is an excellent volunteer, and is particularly interested in the Amarna period. So for the last few months, she's been involved in a pottery project that we have at the museum. She has also been involved in cataloguing our ring bezels and documenting them in the Egypt Centre collection. And it's a great pleasure to really have her working with the collection and to bring her some joy really in such difficult times. As you'll see from the slide, Olga is from Ukraine. So the last few months have been particularly difficult for her, and it's great that she has the environment of the Egypt Centre to come and really take her mind off things. So thank you, Olga, for agreeing to give this talk, which is on your connected to your PhD research. We're really looking forward to it, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So good evening to everyone, and thank you for coming today. My lecture today is dedicated to the study of the influence of ancient Egyptian queens on the military history and their role in the public display of power and propaganda of bellicosity of kinship. So despite the fact that the study of women's military activity has become an important aspect of modern gender history and the history of ancient civilizations, this topic is still very debated because the study of gender in war and women's great contribution and influence on military and political history continues to experience serious contradictions based on the existing rejection of the idea of females' capability of participation in hostilities alongside men. And so today we are going to discuss the main aspects of the problem of study of powerful women in modern archaeology and Egyptology, the ideology of war and gender in ancient Egypt, and how Egyptian queens represented their bellicosity, and whether they were involved in real military conflicts. So first of all, I would like to ask you to imagine the great Egyptian pharaoh in the midst of the battle. So I'm sure that you will imagine similar to the image of Seti I, athletic, brave, warrior, victorious, and male king. And hardly anyone can imagine a woman in a golden chariot with a bow or sword in her hand, a female pharaoh in the heat of the battle, leading an army. This is because we traditionally do not expect women to participate in hostilities. And even if today women have more opportunities to pursue a military career, for most people, women are not associated with war, aggression, violence, and especially with the leadership of the army. In our modern culture, for example, in films, there are not many examples of women in power who led the armies as generals, and most of them are often negative characters. Historical cases of women warriors, such as Joan of Arc or Queen Boudica, are considered exceptional, and the military policies of many other female rulers or even regions are simply ignored in modern historiography, and often due to lack of the information in the sources, since the military activity of female rulers, especially in antiquity, is always very poorly documented. Thus, the modern study of women and war in ancient Near East is primarily faced too many related issues. to main related issues. So it's a deliberate exclusion of women from military duties in ancient times due to the existence of a strict division of gender roles in societies, resulting in a significant reduction of available sources of women's military activity, and the absence of recent historical research of this topic due to the lack of interest among scholars till the end of the 12th century. Until quite recently, the historical and archaeological studies were centered predominantly on men and were studied by men, while comparatively limited attention has been paid to women and their role in history, especially if it's concerned female military activities. The silence of women in history was supported by stereotypes and beliefs about gender roles that influenced the development of scientific knowledge in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the history of ancient people was studied through the prism of the existing model of gender roles and common division of labor. Descriptions of warrior women, for example, the Amazons, have quite frequently impartial character in scientific literature, while examination of the military policies of many ancient female rulers, for example, has been absent from recent studies, supporting long-standing myth of peaceful female kings who were reluctant to wage wars. A British social anthropologist, Edwin Adner, stressed that women were always studied from male point of view through their perception, and that women remain voiceless masses alongside inarticulate classes of other men, children, and older people. Only in the second half of the 20th century, women of all periods of human history became the object of study due to the emergence of the second wave of the women's liberation movement and the first publication of feminist anthropology. Despite new advances in the study of women in modern historiography, the long-standing stereotypes about the role of women in history have entrenched in many fields of science, and especially in the study of gender and war. The gender study revealed many problems and existence so-called androcentrism in archaeology and anthropology. For example, the long existing view of linking the ability to wage war with biological sex and making the differences between the sexes as criterion for military ability was based on the idea that evolution has caused males to be aggressive and females to be maternal. Traditionally, in modern models of human evolution, women were portrayed as less active and more dependent on men, which accordingly is confirmed by the existence of the myth of the male hunters, based on the assertion of the dominant role of men in the separation of hominids from primates. Today, it's already obvious that the problem of equality between women and men in all domains, as all the roots of women's inferiority throughout the history, was largely depends on the cultural features and rules of developed society. Nevertheless, the false theory of natural divisions of labor based on the obvious biological distinctions between sexes and natural predispositions of men to wage war caused the androcentrism in archaeology. American archaeologists Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector pointed to the problem of the determination of the objects in graves according to the sex of the deceased. For example, various types of weapons, especially arrows, bows, swords, are always associated with men and poles with women. Margaret Conkey stressed that researchers bring to their work preconceived notions about what each sex ought to do, and these notions serve to structure the way artifacts are interpreted. A British archaeologist, Timothy Taylor, stressed the same problem of androcentrism in archaeology when wealth burials of the early Anglo-Saxon period have been classified as male or female, predominantly according to the basis of grave goods. So men are with weapons, women are with jewelry, so by default. Such assertion and interpretations of archaeologists reveal the existing problem of prejudicial understanding of the construction of masculinity and femininity in ancient societies and the material culture associated with them. For example, the examination of military equipment from the tomb of the Egyptian queen Amenhotep, which includes daggers and axes, is still debated. In the case of the absence of the mummy of Queen Amenhotep, her burial chamber would have been identified as royal male tomb, according to the nature of burial equipment. Female royal and non-royal burials in ancient Egypt commonly contain the similar types of objects, such as cosmetics, jewelry, amulets for women, and weapons, for example, for men. However, weapons as exclusively male attributes occurred in female tombs a few times and provoked debates whether these burials were female or whether their weapons was like part of ritual. In the case of Queen Amenhotep, it also have been assumed that it was just a cache rather than the original burial of the queen. And these objects were taken from several tombs, primarily because the grave goods are very untypical for traditional female burials in ancient Egypt. Untypical, yes, but not exclusive. There are at least 3 Naqada tombs of women buried with weapons. The grave 1488 was described by Petrie in Naqada as a female burial with alabaster mace in front of her forehead and a mace head behind the back. Another Naqada tomb, 1401, contained a female body buried with 3 stone mace heads and a flint knife. Petrie also described another grave with the female body and the mace numbered 1417. And Rebecca Dean, in her monograph devoted to the study of warfare in Egypt, pointed out that mace had in the grave 1417 possibly serving at least partly votive purpose, as it was so highly decorated. But the mace heads from other 2 tombs, female graves, they were unlikely to have been votive and being potentially functional and indicate.
I think we lost your sound there, Olga. Did we?
Yeah, we've lost your sound, Olga. Can you hear us? So you're on mute at the moment, Olga.
Yeah, maybe try talking now. Does it work?
No, we're still not getting you, Olga. If you go down to the bottom, it's normally the bottom left of your screen, you'll have the little icon of the microphone. There'll be a little arrow next to it. Yeah, there we go.
Sorry,
yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, sorry. I don't know why. Problem with internet connection, I think. Yeah, okay, sorry. So we will discuss later that Rebecca Dean proposed the idea that that weapon from Naqada tombs in from female graves being potentially functional and indicated the level of power and influence of these women. We will discuss later that the military symbols and weapons were predominantly used by queens in dynastic Egypt to emphasize, first of all, their political power. There are also known precedents for burying weapons in royal female tombs, for example, the dagger from the coffin of Princess Etam. The second and very important problem of studying female military activity in ancient Near East is the lack of evidence based on the generally accepted practice of women's exclusion from military activities. Ancient Egyptian society, as well as other societies in ancient Near East, was strictly patriarchal, where a person was always perceived by society through gender and not through his or her personal traits, skill, or character. Moreover, it was gender that strictly determined the status and role in society, the limits of the permissible behavior, and even the sphere of activity. There were universally recognized stereotypes about what men or a woman should be and how should they behave. Ancient people demonstrated their differences and similarities through their interaction with material objects that represent and affect gender, for example, dresses, weapons, or even tools. Egyptologist Urus Matis has stressed that gender is violent because it sets an unequal status, influence, and access to power between different genders. According to the view, women were seen as a separate group without access to many strictly masculine activities such as warfare, because war was an exclusively male activity. War and hunting that bring to destruction of life have traditionally been identified with male cultural activities and have always been oppositional to the nature, so to women. Moreover, warfare has always been perceived as indispensable and highly valued characteristic of male personality, whereas female warriors have been seen as essentially unsettling to the social order. It can be assumed that the gender division of labor and the women's exclusion from military activity during the old periods of history was grounded on the idea that men just stronger than women and women like weaker and more passive due to their reproductive features, and they were responsible more for example, from gathering and not for hunting. But this conception is also incorrect. American anthropologists George Murdoch and Catherine Provost, in their study of sex allocation of 50 technological activities in 185 societies in the 6 major and ethnographic regions in another oath, identified 14 strictly masculine activities such as hunting, metalworking, smelting ores, and other, and many of these male tasks require comparatively little physical strength. So it was assumed that economies of efforts rather than physical differences in strength, physical strength, causes a universal division labor by sex. The separation of male and female activities led to their inequality of gender roles in society because the public sphere of activity, which includes political power and military service, is often given more prestige than the responsibility of childcare. Thus, in ancient Egypt, the ideology of war and aggression had also been the basic concept of the Egyptian kingship since the earliest times. The warfare was a necessary ritual of protection of the world order, Ma'at. The king was a god, the head of the country, and of course, the warrior leader. During the New Kingdom, the Egyptian pharaoh became a symbol of strength and belligerence due to the threat of invasions, further militarization of the country, and concurring international policy of the 18th dynasty kings. By the time of Thutmose III and his victory at Megiddo, when he defeated the alliance of Syrian rebel rulers, not only the image of the pharaohs as the military leader was emphasized, but the king was perceived as a hero. The main distinctive feature of the New Kingdom kingship was the importance of the presence of the king at the battle and his ability to lead the army as a great warrior, as, for example, Thutmose III did. The tradition of training of a hereditary princes as a combat, because they had to learn a lot of art of war, was also established in the New Kingdom. Such warrior scenes are located in the external walls of temples that indicate the growing prominence of temples in ancient Egypt. And the aggression of the king was a ritual action dedicated to the gods and serving to defend the microcosm against disorder. War propaganda was very important to the New Kingdom pharaohs and demonstrated the mighty and bravery of the kings, the favor of the gods, and that the ruler met the expectations of the administrative and religious system. Even when the pharaoh was physically absent on the battlefield, as Thutmose II, for example, who sent just his army to Nubia, text was aimed to glorify the pharaoh by emphasizing his role in restoring order and his successful fight with the forces of chaos, without presenting him as a hero on the battlefield. Theoretically, the army could win battles successfully without participation of the pharaoh, but the victory could be possible only with the divine protection of the pharaoh, who carried out the will of the gods to maintain order, and the absence of the king in the core of the battle do not impact on his popular images of warrior and victorious monarch. Not army, but a pharaoh won the battle, acting as the son of God with divine help and protection. So it's very important to understand about Egyptian kinship. In the representation of royal chariot chasing in Egyptian reliefs, the king is always staying alone in the chariot, despite the fact that in reality he must be accompanied by someone with a shield to protect the king. And also there are images of other gods and goddesses near with hymns, for example, Horus, Nekhbet, Mut, or Montu. They very often represented above the pharaoh, protect the pharaoh and help him. King's physical warrior skills and his strength were demonstrated in art, where king was trampling his enemies, cuts their throats, crushes their heads by his own hands, while other soldiers and even high-ranking generals, they could be presented only taking the captives or with the hands of defeated warriors, but not killing the enemies. The military feature of Egyptian kinship was the main reason of female exclusion from political power. Queens were opposite to the kings in art, except some cases that we are going to discuss today. The queen was identified with the goddess, symbolized the female principle of fertility, and accompanied the pharaoh during his religious duties, political events, or, for example, state celebrations, except of the warrior scenes. The title queen is also conditional, because royal women in ancient Egypt didn't have a separate independent title emphasizing their political influence, and in text they often referred as sisters, wives, or mothers of the ruling pharaohs. Women's subordinated position in society could be seen clearly through the Egyptian art, and which has strict rules for depiction of women, for example, in their size, in their positions towards men, and even their gestures. Gay Robbins pointed out to the lack of representation of women doing physical activities, especially with their, for example, type of dress, and comparing with the male images in Egyptian art. There was no special tradition in Egyptian art to represent warlike or women, or just active women in hunting or something like that. Traditionally, men and women were depicted with different color of skin. So women had pale yellow skin, while men were mostly presented with reddish brown skin color. And taking into account the importance of color in Egyptian culture, it was not just the representation of reality, and the color was an indicator of gender. The reddish brown color of male skin emphasized masculinity, power, and strength, because red color traditionally symbolized fire, blood, danger, forces, dangerous forces, anger, and death. Men could and should be aggressive by default, and this was their nature according to the conventional view of the Egyptians. Lana Troy, in her brilliant monograph on ancient Egyptian queenship, suggested the complementarity of the male and female roles and the representation of the king-queen union as the divine brother-sister pair of the gods Shu and Tefnut, making them equal in sharing the authority as two parallel elements of the one system of power that provides an ideological justification for the accession of female pharaoh. However, the female kings came to power only in exceptional cases, and there was no pattern for female kinship in ancient Egyptian iconography and ideology. As was mentioned earlier, the special title queen that has been commonly used today for royal women in ancient Egypt was absent in ancient Egyptian language. And all women who came to power in Egypt used traditional masculine titles that were represented as male kings in iconography very often. And even if they combined masculine, for example, and feminine elements, emphasizing their gender, they still based their public image on generally accepted principle of the Egyptian kinship, masculinity. The equality of political influence and power between king and queen was not possible, primarily because of the basic feature of kinship, such as belligerence, explicitly interaction with gods, and the traditional identification of kings with male gods. Royal women, except of a few cases of more powerful queens, were totally excluded from the demonstration of their physical strength, military activity that was exclusively occupied by male kings and only by men. The only exception could be seen during the last years of the reign of King Akhenaten, when the political position of Queen Nefertiti was based on the new religious concept. The queen was an essential part of the so-called divine triad of the god Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti. So she represents a female element being necessary for the recreation of life. And because Akhenaten was at the same time a religious and political leader, the influence of Nefertiti was very huge, and she was not a typical queen consort. All the religious and political scenes of Akhenaten were duplicated with the participation of Nefertiti, including the most important violent scenes of demonstration of her physical strength. Her unique position led to her coregency with her husband, and then to her sole rule. In this case, we have a more and less ideal conception of the union of male and female elements that was the basic feature of the sovereignty of ancient Egypt, the representation of equal king-queen union. But as I said, it was an exceptional case. In any other cases, to be a king of Egypt for a woman meant to be a man. They changed their gender role, and only then they could have been accepted by the Egyptian society as a pharaohs. It's also very important to mention the distinction between terms sex and gender, and sex is primarily considered as a biological trait, and the distinction between male and female and their reproductive functions, while gender is a purely cultural and social construct, determining generally accepted feminine and masculine roles of people in different societies. So because of the significance of warfare and the belligerence of the ruling kings as the basic elements of the Egyptian kinship, royal women used military symbols primarily to emphasize their real political power. Such symbols often occurred in the representation of women who had a great political influence or who became rulers of Egypt. The earliest evidence of warrior symbols in female royalty came from the early dynastic period with the dominance of the goddess Neith, which had been worshipped since the late pre-dynastic period. During the Old Kingdom, Neith was also a deity of Lower Egypt and was frequently presented as a bellicose deity. As a warrior goddess, Neith possessed the emblem consisted of crossed arrows and bows, and she was called mistress of the bow, ruler of arrows, and her theophoric names includes, for example, Neith fights or Neith victorious. Neith was associated with male and female royalty. The name of Neith was added to the names of two queens of the first dynasty, Neith-hotep and Mer Neith, and the goddess's standard decorated the queen Serech instead traditional image of the god Horus. So that could indicate that the queen's power was comparable to the king's one during the Old Kingdom. Neith emblem of crossed arrows appeared in the chair decoration of the 4th dynasty queen Hatepheres. The goddess Neith also functioned as a creator in ancient Egyptian mythology, and she was associated with the waters of a region and was considered as an androgynous deity, being a mother of the sun without a partner. The masculinity of Neith has been represented through her belligerence and her association with the bow and arrow. The significance of the warrior goddess Neith for the Egyptian queenship declined after the Old Kingdom, and this may have been due to the decline in the influence of queens. But of course, we don't have evidence of the military activity of early queens, even if we know that some of them were regents. So, and you can see that they only used so-called military symbols, their names, so bows and arrows. So the start of military activity of royal women faced the problem of finding the hidden evidence of the real political and military influence of the queens, as this information usually didn't represent in ancient sources. There were queens, for example, regents, who ruled on behalf of their sons and had never bore the king's titles, but they were real pharaohs of Egypt, because regency was the main source of real political power for queens, and female rulers could not avoid a military obligation if they were the pharaohs of Egypt. For instance, Queen Anhsenpepi II, mother of the 6th dynasty King Pepi II, who came to the throne in a very young age. He could not have been more than 6 years old. So Anhsenpepi II was a regent and ruled on behalf of her young son. The representation of Anhsenpepi II as a regent can be seen in the alabaster statue in the Brooklyn Museum, where she is sitting on the throne with her young son on her lap, with his feet on the second throne, with the inscription of his royal name. Other evidence of the regency of Anhsenpepi II comes from a rock inscription in the Sinai dating to the second regnal year of the king, where her name and titles follow the king's name. The pyramid of Anhsenpepi II is the largest at Pepi's pyramid complex, and she appears to be the first royal woman to have pyramid text in her pyramid. Damaged block from Queen's Mortuary Temple represent Anhsenpepi II in action. So her legs are not stained together, like very typical for women's representation in art, but she's represented as if she's taken a step. So it was a typical representation of males in Egyptian art. And Lisa Sabahi assumed that Anhsenpepi's stance seems to make a statement of masculinity, in that she fulfilled a male role when she functioned as king on behalf of her young son, very young son. There were at least 2 expeditions conducted during the first years of Pepi II. And during the first years of Pepi II reign. The Sinai inscription dating to the regnal year 2 bears the name of Queen Anhsenpepi II and the name of her son, King Pepi II, and the members of expedition, including soldiers. The second famous expedition to the land of Yam in Lower Nubia was conducted by governor of the south, the nobleman Harhuf, dating to the regnal year 2. So even once more, King Pepi was maybe no more than 8 years old, maybe 10, it depends on the dating. So, and here in this inscription, Harhuf, we know that he was sent in Nubia with the army. And the peaceful nature of this expedition remains controversial, but the text refers to the application of military force or the threat of force, because Harhuf had the army. In the inscription from his tomb, Harhuf pointed out that it was a king who asked him to bring a dancing dwarf and who organized the expedition. But according to the days of the expedition, it's possible to claim with confidence that Anhisen Pepi II organized and managed this expedition on behalf of her very young son. We also have a free military expedition to Nubia during the reign of Pepi II. And but unfortunately, because we don't have dates of this expedition, so it's very difficult to determine whether Anhisen Pepi II organized this expedition or the Pepi II himself. But these two expeditions during the first years of the reign of Pepi II could possibly be organized by Anhisen Pepi II, so the mother of Pepi II, who was a regent on behalf of his son. The next example is previously mentioned Queen Amenhotep, the mother of King Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty. And she, according to the sources, Ahmose's minimum reign length should be 21 years and the maximum 25 full years, because we have evidence and dates of his reign. And the mummy of King Ahmose was estimated to be that of a man of 25-30 years old. So he came to the throne at a very, very young age. Maybe some scholars believe that he was approximately 5 years old. And his mother, Queen Amenhotep, had been a regent during the long and very troubled times in ancient Egypt. She was involved in warfare, and her military activity has been recorded by her son Ahmose on the votive stela. He stressed that she took care of Egypt, looked after trained soldiers, and guarded soldiers, pacified Upper Egypt, and expelled its rebels. Queen Amenhotep's tomb contained a great number of weapons, including daggers and axes, and one of the daggers was found on the mummy of Queen Amenhotep, so I mean inside the coffin on the mummy, and the identical dagger has been found on the breast of the mummy of Kamose as a symbol of power and domination. Kamose, the great warrior pharaoh, king Theban of Theban dynasty. And Tom Neal, in his book devoted to Queen Amenhotep, suggested that this dagger may suggest Amenhotep's great military achievements, because it was the same pattern of burial equipment as in the grave of a warrior king Kamose. So there was also an archer's amulet in Amenhotep's tomb. A militaristic connection has been suggested because of the vertical projection you can see on the side, which has been argued to protect the inner wrist of an archer from the drawn bow string once fired. And of course, the famous necklace of Queen Amenhotep with 3 large golden flies is very, very interesting thing, because they were found on the mummy of Queen Amenhotep, and Cyril Aldrich specified that this type of objects was used as a military decoration for bravery, since the soldier, for example, Amos Ben Necheb, who fought under the early rulers of the 18th dynasty, was awarded by 6 flies from Thutmose I. So we could assume that it's such kind of necklace of bravery for military achievements. As I mentioned earlier, if it was a mummy of a male king, there would be no room for discussion. But because these weapons bear the name of male kings, Kamose and Ahmose, and not Amenhotep, it was assumed that the female burial had been filled with weapon accidentally, despite the fact that the necklace and dagger were found on the queen's mummy. So the cases of Anhisen Pepi II and Amenhotep clearly indicated the so-called invisibility of women in sources related to the warfare. French archaeologist Philippe Clancier pointed to the invisibility of royal women in ancient sources related to warfare, even if these women were regents and military leaders acting along or with their heirs and husbands. They were not mentioned directly in the sources as warrior queens, even if they were involved in a military conflict, because the war was viewed as exclusively masculine domain in the official royal inscriptions. Reinhard Bernberg has also indicated to the prejudice against powerful and warrior women in ancient sources, academic works, and even in popular culture, on the example of Queen Shamuramat, who ruled the Assyrian Empire and even took part in the campaign in the West, but was excluded from the king's list, and her military activity and political influence had not been fully reflected in sources and even in modern studies due to the Orientalist stereotypes. And other queen, the wife of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, Queen Zakutu, who apparently helped her son to ascend the Assyrian throne and supported him during the period of his struggle with his brother, who took up armies against him. Even though Queen Zakutu had political and military power after her husband's assassination, no sources place her on the battlefield, and Philippe Clancier has mentioned that all glory is accorded to her son. So in the case of royal women, so in a case when women have had political military power, and for example, as queens Anheshenpepi II and Ahotep, very often their names were not included in sources related to warfare. And fortunately, we have, for example, a stele of Ahmose, of her son, who explained her military achievement of her mother. But very often we just have to find such hidden evidence of military activity of such women, especially if they were regents on behalf of their young sons. In case if royal women came to power and seized the throne officially as a king of Egypt, they should have demonstrated their bellicosity like a typical male king. So, the female pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, Sobeknefru, who ruled at the end of 12th dynasty, emphasized her bellicosity and presented herself as a military leader and a defender of Egypt. On the city statues, Sobeknefru is shown putting her feet atop of the symbols of 9 bows, the traditional enemies of Egypt. The image of trampoline, the 9 bows, was used by the pharaohs to emphasize their dominance over Egypt's enemies. In her article examining Sobeknefru's representation, Killian Diamond stressed that even epithets of Sobeknefru, such as daughter of power and lord of action, could symbolize her ability and willingness to fight for Egypt. And the addition of the male garment to her female garment on the buste from the Louvre Museum emphasized the image of masculine power and authority, because, as I said to you, it was very important for female kings to emphasize their masculinity for the public propaganda of their power, their political power, first of all. Sobeknefru, like other Egyptian queens such as Hatshepsut, Queen Tia, Nefertiti, also used the images of female sphinx, which symbolize the power of Hathor Sekhmet, who destroyed the enemies of Ram. Sphinx inscription of Sobeknefru from Tel el-Daba, in the we can see on this inscription her title, her military title, like the Lord of Actions and Daughter of Power, and also this shape of Sphinx, traditional it was a traditional expression of masculinity and kinship. So the next queen, Hatshepsut, the ruling queen of the 18th dynasty, also used military symbols in her propaganda of her power. Officially, she got a political power as a regent on behalf of her young stepson Thutmose III, and during the early years of her regency, Hatshepsut had portrayed herself in the traditional image of Egyptian queen, and by the 7th regnal year of Thutmose III, Hatshepsut got her royal titles, and her representations has assumed the masculine form. Moreover, the color of her skin the color of the skin of her statues was changed from traditional pale to reddish brown, which can be seen on the statues from her funerary complex and Deir el-Bahri. Areas grouped from the inner temple complex are painted with traditional female yellow pale skin, and others are painted with dark reddish brown. So Everly Mary Ann has assumed that Hatshepsut's attempts to be a female king were not successful, and she adopted a purely male image. But the changing of the model of Hatshepsut's image from female to male could have been caused by the political tension between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Thutmose III became a mature and politically and military capable ruler, and he fitted the ideal image of the Egyptian pharaoh because he was a man. And Hatshepsut began to be portrayed predominantly as a male pharaoh, trying to emphasize her masculinity and her ability to be capable to defend Egypt, protect Ma'at, and defeat the enemies. It can be assumed that the courageousness of Hatshepsut Thutmose III by the end of the rule was not conflict-free in political terms, and the issue of the gender of the ruling pharaoh had become particularly important. The emphasizing of the masculinity led to the confidence in military prowess of Hatshepsut that was very important for the political propaganda. Hatshepsut was represented with her feet atop the 9 bows, like Queen Sobeknefru, and we can see it in different statues. I showed only 2 statues, but they're more representation of Queen Hatshepsut with her feet atop the 9 bows. As was mentioned earlier, the motif of trampling of 9 bows was used primarily by kings to show their dominion over Egypt's enemies. And Hatshepsut's stepson Thutmose III, the great warrior, used these traditional symbols, also like trampling the 9 bows, in his statue, like other Egyptian pharaohs, and also was represented in the shape of Sphinx, and like Ascending Pharaoh and shape of the Sphinx. And the Egyptian king was commonly presented in the manifestation of the Sphinx trampling the enemies, and the wooden panel from the throne of Thutmose IV shows the pharaohs in the form of furious Sphinx subduing the enemies of Egypt. And Hatshepsut and Sobeknefru, as ruling pharaohs, used the shape of Sphinx on their propaganda of their power, but only Hatshepsut, because thus we have this evidence, we still have this evidence of her rule, and only Hatshepsut was represented as a Sphinx trampling her enemies at Deir el-Bahri on the south wall of the northern royal portico, and it was very unusual, as I said to you, for female kings to be represented in such violent scenes. So for Hatshepsut, it is very important, as I said, to emphasize and to represent her, first of all, political and military power and prowess. And also Hatshepsut used epithet, a strong-armed Horus, military epithet, and on the north wall of the chapel 12 of the palace of Maat at Karnak. And she has also been described as a female Horus or as a strong-armed female in her temple at Deir el-Bahri. On the north obelisk in Karnak of Hatshepsut, she is represented as a male king with a mace, and the title Nebetawi Nechel Mat Kara. So it's like Nebetawi, mistress of 2 lands. She used, you can see, the feminine epithet, and also very often she used this title without feminine epithet as a male. So Nebtawi, just the lord of the 2 lands. It's very important for discussion of other ruling queens in ancient Egypt. And so what about the military campaigns of Queen Hatshepsut? As I said earlier, the problem of studying the female rulers and their military activities faced the false misconceptions of female peaceful rulers. Fortunately, the situation has been changed during the last decades. Philip Tatark, in his brilliant article devoted to the study of military campaigns of Hatshepsut, pointed out to the problem of the existence of the myth of a peaceful female ruler, especially Hatshepsut, in the Egyptological literature. That Hatshepsut concentrated herself on the internal affair, paying attention to the legitimization of her power, and that she lost all achievements of the great pharaohs, and that the Egyptian victorious conquest were a credit of her stepson Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut never rejected her military obligations, and the representation of the Iranian soldiers appeared in many places at Deir el-Bahri. And Philip Tatarka pointed out to the 3 military campaigns organized by Queen Hatshepsut. There is an inscription on the walls of the temple of millions of years at Deir el-Bahri about a military campaign to the south to make a massacre among local peoples, and the victory was so great that unknown was the number of killed men, although the hands had been cut off. That's a description of this campaign by King Hatshepsut. Unknown was the number, and Hatshepsut compared this military successful campaign, her military successful campaign, to her father's great campaigns. And this expedition to the southern lands is confirmed also by graffito at Tangur in Nubia, which is dated to regnal year 12 under Matkara and Menhepera, and mentioned the overthrowing of the wretched Kush. So it's not, we don't know exactly who conducted the expedition. So the Thutmose III himself, Hatshepsut, or royal officials, but we have a very interesting graffito at Sahel in the First Cataract region, carved by official named T. I have followed the perfect god Matkara of Hatshepsut, given life. I have seen him overthrowing the Nubian bowmen and bringing to him their chiefs as living captives. I have seen him destroying the land of Nubia while I was in the following of his majesty. Most likely is the same expedition that, for example, the same expedition to the south. And also there is another inscriptions carved on the walls of this tomb. For example, I have seen the king in the wretched Kush. So also some of the officials during the reign of Hatshepsut bore titles related to military activity of the king they served. For instance, Nebni, king's son of Kush, is called the one who follows his lord in his footsteps in the southern and northern foreign lands. Or another title, the one who is beneficial for the perfect goddess, who follows the king at the head of his army in the footsteps in the southern and northern lands. So, so we can see that there are evidences of, and also comparing with the titles and representation of belligerency of Queen Hatshepsut, and the emphasizing of her military prowess and the ability to defend Egypt, is shows that Queen Hatshepsut could be involved in military activity as a ruling pharaoh, as any other male pharaohs, because she was a ruler of Egypt. And another queen, Tausret, she, the queen of the 19th dynasty, she was a wife of Seti II and the co-regent of King Siptah before she proclaimed herself as the sole ruler of Egypt. And she ruled no more than 2 years. So the pattern of her political elimination, the base of her regency is comparable with Hatshepsut's reign. Tausret has been proclaimed the regent of young Siptah, and she obviously was not his mother, and acted like a political regent because of her high political status in the state. After Siptah's death, Queen Tausret seized the throne as the king of Egypt and rules no more than 2 years. And in her official titulary, she emphasized her religions very clearly. So, for example, you can see her Horus name is Strong Bull, beloved of Maat, and her Nepti name is found in Egypt and crushing the foreigners. Very untypical, yes, for a female king. Both names have masculine form, and they are derived from the Strong Bull names of Ramesses II and Thutmose I. The title found in Egypt and crushing the foreigners is an exceptional title, and she is the only one who bore this title. And for example, Gay Calendar in her article assumed that this title reflects foreign invasions into Egypt and or maybe military conflicts with people from Near East, and this campaign against these people who was led by Queen Tausret. She also used the title Lord of Two Lands without feminine epithet as a male king. So, and you can see there's a photo of this famous statue of Queen Tausret. Unfortunately, I can't see the traces of 9 bows under her feet on this photo, so it's quite difficult. So I've never seen this statue in reality, so I can't say if there are 9 bows under her feet. So, or no, but we still have the title Lord of Two Lands. It's also very important title for royal female kings. And Queen Tausret also possessed a very important title, Lady of Might, and sorry, it's Lady of Might, and especially Lady of Action or Doing Things. The common royal king's title, for example, Neb Eret Het, so Lord of Doing Things, that referred to some cultural ritual and even to military activity of the king, was very rare. I mean, for female rules, and only 2 queens, as we know, Tausret and Sobeknefru, they bore this title. So, as we think that title referred to military activity of the king, so the Lord of Doing Things. And accordingly, so this type of title was exclusively male, and so we think that it's this title highlighted the pharaoh's role as a guardian of Maat. So, and there is also a scarab with the name of Queen Tausret, and are the 2 famous warrior pharaohs, Thutmose III and Senusret III. So you can see that her name like mentioned with the names of 2 famous warrior pharaohs of Egypt. And the image of the warrior queen with the bow in her hands from an ostrakon from the Cairo Museum, discovered in Kivi-9 in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb Kivi-9, the Valley of the Kings, dated to the 20th dynasty, is usually attributed to the representation of Queen Tausret acting against her rival Setnacht, who became a king of Egypt after Tausret. And the woman of the ostrakon is dressed in the costume and headdress of the Egyptian queen. So we don't know exactly, but we can assume that it could be Queen Tausret. And moreover, the situation in Egypt during the reign was very dramatic, and Egypt was invaded in its delta regions by people from the Near East, and Tausret would be expected to send her army or even took part in war campaign against the invaders. It's very important to remember that to study the role of queens in military history, it's essential to understand the social, cultural, and political situation at the time of their ruling of their reign to evaluate their political and military activity. It cannot be accepted that just because they were women, for example, female pharaohs abandoned their military duties, especially if they ruled in troubled times and periods of foreign invasions. And the title and epithets of Tausret clearly emphasized military prowess as well as the titles of other queens such as Hatshepsut and Sobeknefru. Unfortunately, it's slide to about title of Lady of Action and title of Taos Red, so you can see, because just I think that I accidentally switched the slides, so you can see that it's quite interesting that she that Taos Red bears the title Lady of Action, very because, as I said, it was like male titles only for male kings. So, and there are also other queens in ancient Egypt, and especially in New Kingdom, who were represented in violent scenes related to the propaganda bellicosity of the Egyptian kingship. Many new features of queenship iconography were imposed during the reign of King Amenhotep III, its 18th dynasty, and seems to have been linked with the growing influence of Queen Tia, his principal wife. One of the most important is the addition of the solar disk and Hathor horns of the vulture crown and 2 falcon palms that emphasize the divine nature of a queen. But also Queen Tia was often depicted in the shape of Sphinx. You can see on one of these images of Queen Tia in the shape of Sphinx. Queen Tia is one of the 6 queens in Egyptian history who were represented in the scene of smiting the enemy. And other 5 are Queens Ieret, is a wife of Thutmose IV, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Anhisinemun, and Nefertari. So the representation of queens in such violent scenes is very rare and very exceptional. 3 of 6 queens who have been represented in such kind of scenes were rulers of Egypt. It's Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Anhisinemun. And Tia could have been possibly a regent of her son Akhenaten during his first regnal year. Such military scenes emphasized the exclusive political position in the state of these queens. In the tomb of Heref of Queen Tia, in the tomb of Heref, Queen Tia is represented sitting on the throne, and on the side of a panel of her throne, she is represented in the form of Sphinx, trampling female Nubian and Asiatic enemies, and there is a winged serpent in white Egyptian crown with the characteristic trampling of foreign lands, and the queen's titles included Mistress of the Lands united with the king. And other very interesting representation of Queen Tia, as on the seal of Amenhotep III, accompanied his wife Tia, while he's killing the enemy before a Syrian ruler. The same scene is represented on the scarab, where Tia accompanied her husband smiting an enemy. And the scene of smiting an enemy was a demonstration of domination of the foreign countries and emphasizing of military prowess of the ruling pharaohs. And the other very interesting scene from a relief of the tomb in West Thebes, with a statue of Queen Tia standing on an enemy. Yeah, very, very unusual and very violent scene, and unusual representation of Egyptian queen. So, and as I mentioned earlier, only 6 queens in Egyptian history were represented in the scenes of smiting the enemy, and only 4 of them were holding weapons in their hands. So Nefertiti, Ieret, Hatshepsut, and Anhisinemun. Nefertiti was briefly mentioned earlier, but there is also one of the queen of the 18th dynasty who deserves special attention on the study of examining her influence of women on the history of war in ancient Egypt is Queen Anhisinemun, daughter of Akhenaten and wife of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun died at the age of 19 years old, and the Vizier I usurped the Egyptian throne in turn after his death. And then in 4 years, Horemheb was crowned king of Egypt, and both of them proclaimed themselves as official successors of Tutankhamun. And Anhisinemun, who remained the last member of the royal dynasty, simply disappeared from Egyptian official sources. Her personality and her role in Egyptian history are not well studied. In modern scientific literature, however, her attempt to sign a political and military alliance with the Hittite kings to defend her rights for the Egyptian throne is very significant for understanding her status during the reign of Tutankhamun and the impact of her actions on the international situation in the Near East after her husband's death. Because her international policy caused a war between the Hittite Empire and Egypt, it's quite interesting to study this case. Ankhesenamun was not crowned as the pharaoh of Egypt, but she acted as the legitimate ruler, and she wanted to consolidate her power with the help of political alliance with the Hittite, sending 2 letters to the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma I, asking him for a prince to make him her husband and a king of Egypt. These 2 letters were mentioned in the Hittite source, the deeds of Suppiluliuma, written later by his son Mursili II, where she asked for a prince sent into Egypt. And Suppiluliuma didn't know what to do, and first of all he sent an envoy, Hattusazidi, for investigation, so sent him to Egypt. And the Hittite king wanted to be sure that there were no official male successor, because he didn't want to be involved in the internal struggle for the Egyptian throne. So we know that because Mursili II wrote the story of the reign, the history of the reign of his father Suppiluliuma I. And the envoy came back with another letter from Queen Ankhesenamun, but this time the tone of the letter to Suppiluliuma I was relatively strict. And you know that Ankhesenamun asked why did you speak in this way? They deceived me. If I had a son, would I have written about the shame of myself and my land to another land? And she asked, why didn't you trust me? So, and you can see that the tone of the letter is quite unusual, especially if we knew that it was written by a queen. Ankhesenamun's request was absolutely unprecedented, and why? So it was very unusual for royal women to ask for a prince to marry her. Commonly, kings asked for foreign princes for their harems or for marriage. And secondly, the Egyptian royal women had never married foreign princes in accordance of old tradition, based on the desire to maintain the power in their hands, in the hands of Egyptian dynasty, so original dynasty. And the Hittite Empire in Egypt were in the brink of war at the time. So, but even if we have such solid evidence of political activity of female ruler, many scholars do not give particular attention to Ankhesenamun and ignore her political influence or simply present her as a victim. So, and you can see, for example, that some scholars believe that, for example, Ankhesenamun wanted to unite the 2 biggest kingdoms in the Near East. So it's according to the myth of peaceful female rulers. Or sometimes it has been assumed that she was acted with Vizier Ayem, and the Ayem was the driving force behind her decision to write the letter to Hittite king. Or some scholars also doubt that Ankhesenamun could write this letter to the Hittite king, and that's why they suggested that this affair was a ploy by Vizier Ayem. And in the literature, we see the ignorance of the possibility that the queen could act on her own and pursuing a personal goal in the desire to ascend the throne and receive military support from the Hittite king if it's necessary for him. If we look more detailed to Ankhesenamun's sources, we can see her exclusive position in the state. Ankhesenamun was represented in the scenes of smiting the enemy and sitting at the feet of her husband while she gives him arrows and destroy enemies in the form of animals. These kind of scenes were symbolic attributes of royal dominance over the united Egypt, and the royal hunting scenes were traditionally symbolic representation of royal power, belligerence, and queen's potency to maintain order in the terrestrial realm. And on the golden shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb, Akhenaten Anhisenamun bears titles Lord of the Two Lands without feminine epithet. As you know, remember the same epithets bore Queens Tausret and Queen Tausret, Queen Hatshepsut. So on the inscription on the front of the shrine in the middle right scene, Anhisenamun is mentioned as Lord of the Two Lands. Anhisenamun may she lives, while Tutankhamun is called just the perfect god, Nebkheperura given life, without indication of his personal name. The title Lord of Two Lands was used 3 times on the golden shrine of King Tutankhamun. And the once Anhisenamun paired her name with the name of King Tutankhamun, so, and without any indication of her status of great royal wife. So, for example, we expect, for example, the king's nomen and prenomen together, but instead of this we can see the king's name and personal name and name of Queen Anhisenamun. And Anhisenamun also bears the title Mary Beret Hekau, so the beloved of the goddess Beret Hekau. Beret Hekau is the creator of magic, is a certain goddess closely connected with the coronation ceremony. And you can see the representation of Thutmose IV as a furious sphinx subduing the enemies of Egypt on the wooden panel of this chair. But on the other side, we can see the kings showing the red crown and being crowned by the goddess Beret Hekau during the ceremony of coronation. And Marian Itten-Krause has argued that the repeated emphasis on the protection and affection of the goddess Beret Hekau of the king and queen and the text of on the golden shrine may have been referred to their joint rule, so co-regency of King Tutankhamun and Queen Anhisenamun. In these scenes on the golden shrine, Anhisenamun presented giving Tutankhamun lotus and papyrus as the allegory of the unification of the two lands, or she supports her husband touching his hand and wearing the cap crown with royal urus as a ruler. The same type of crown was used by Queen Hatshepsut in the scene of the nursing of the divine Hathor Ko in the south wall of the inner sanctuary in Hathor Chapel of the temple at Deir Bahri. By the type of creation of the chapel, Hatshepsut had already been a ruler of Egypt, so she used this type of crown during her reign as the king of Egypt. After Tutankhamun's death, Queen made an attempt to assume the political power, possibly following the example of her mother, Queen Nefertiti, but she forced a strong position, and because her main problem was in the absence of the male heir, and she couldn't be a regent. So she wrote a letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, asking him for alliance through the marriage, and as her predecessors did. Hittologist Trevor Bryce argued that according to the deeds of Suppiluliuma, Anhisenamun delayed the burial ceremony of King Tutankhamun for more than 6 months, waiting the arrival of the Hittite prince. And according to the deeds of Suppiluliuma, we know that the Hittite king sent a messenger to Egypt to investigate the political situation in Egypt, and only then he decided to send his son Sananza to Egypt. And Hittologist Trevor Bryce mentioned very clearly that it's inconceivable that Suppiluliuma would have sent his son to Egypt without such verification that Tutankhamun was survived by any person of royal birth who could make a claim upon the throne. This is very important information, confirming that at the time there was no legitimate heir to the throne except for Anhisenamun, and that Anhisenamun has had sufficient political power and influence in the state to make this Hittite prince king of Egypt. So we know that the queen's attempt to marry Hittite prince failed. Prince Ananza was killed on the road of Egypt, and unfortunately we know that the war between Hittite empire and Egypt started, and Anhisenamun was probably forced to marry Aya, and who became the king of Egypt, and then she disappeared from history. The Japanese Egyptologist Nozomu Kawai regarded the huge campaign of Horemheb purpose of which was the elimination of memory of Anhis-Amun, that would be unwise if the queen didn't play a dominant political role after Tutankhamun's death. So in conclusion, I would like to mention that the main problem in studying the role of royal women in the military history of the ancient Near East is not the absence of warrior queens or their insignificant influence on military history, and not even the lack of evidence, but first and foremost, the lack of prolonged lack of appropriate approach, free from prejudice and bias, and the elaborated methodology for studying gender. And also it's very important, as I mentioned earlier, to study the role of queens in military history. It's essential to understand the social, cultural, and political situation at the time of their reigning, to evaluate their real political and military activity. And that the importance of revealing women with significant political influence lies in the need to reconstruct the real political situation, as for example in the case of Queen Anhis-Amun, and to fill the gaps and restore the historical justice, first of all. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Olga, for that excellent lecture. I think everybody, I'm sure, will have enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, then do please post them into the chat and we can read them out to Olga as well. So there are some questions that have come through already. And I know that I haven't spoken to you previously, Olga, that you're very convinced of the idea that Ankhesenamun was a ruler of Egypt. So do you think it was just as a co-regent with her husband, or independently following the death of her husband Tutankhamun? Both.
Yeah, during the reign of King Tutankhamun, she was a co-regent, but after his death, for 6 months approximately, she was a ruler of Egypt. Not crowned, of course, by the ruler and ruler of Egypt, waiting for the letters from Hittite king, and from and as I said, that it's very important for us to know that Hittite king finally sent his prince to Egypt. That it's a very important message for us to understand that she had political power in Egypt to make his the Hittite prince the king of Egypt. So I suppose that yes, she was a ruler of Egypt during these months. And then something happened, and Vizier-Aya usurped the throne. Possibly, as I said, because she didn't have a male heir, so she couldn't be a regent, and maybe she didn't have maybe like support, maybe enough support in the court. We don't know exactly, but unfortunately she couldn't do that. And as I said, it was very difficult for women to seize the throne in Egypt, and very often they did it, as I said, because they were regents, first of all.
And she's still relatively young at this stage.
Yes, she was no more than 23 years old.
Yeah,
it's approximately, yeah, because we know the date of her birth. It's approximately 7th or 8th regnal year of Akhenaten, according to the boundary stela in Akhenaten. So yes, she was no more than 22, 23 years old. But I think, yes, of course, she died very quickly after when Aya seized the throne, because she disappeared from history. And as I said, she was not a typical queen consort. It's very important to remember that she was born in Akhenaten. She was a daughter of King Akhenaten, and she never knew, I mean, her the pattern of queenship, traditional pattern of queenship in ancient Egypt. And she acted as her mother, Queen Nefertiti, who had a very, very huge political and military influence in the state. So that's why for her it was very not unusual to write to the hated king, because possibly she believed that she could be a ruler of Egypt.
Mm. And do you have any thoughts of Merit Aten as a potential co-regent with her husband Smenkhare?
Oh, it's a difficult question, but yeah, yes, because Smenkhare died during the reign of Akhenaten, so he was a co-regent of King Akhenaten. So I think that because Akhenaten was a quite I was called like a strong leader, strong king, so it was, I think, very difficult to be co-regent with King Akhenaten. So in terms political influence was not so great.
So we have a question from Carolyn here, who is asking if you see the New Kingdom increase in military queens as associated with other gender changes around that time, such as Hatshepsut's divine birth scene, the increase of female goddesses becoming androgynous, for example, Mut and Neith, and the divine Eye of Re becoming creative. So does this also relate to the increase in the androgyny of male kings?
Could you repeat, please, because I have a problem with I can't hear it.
Yeah, it's in the chat as well. If you want to read it, if it's easier, but I'll read it out to you. So Carolyn was just asking if you see the increase, the New Kingdom increase in military queens, such as Hatshepsut and others, as associated with other gender changes around that time. So, for example, Hatshepsut and her divine birth scenes, the increase of female goddesses becoming more androgynous, such as Mut and Neith, and the divine Eye becoming creative.
Could you send please me this?
Yeah, I'll post it to you. It is in the chat. Which, oh no, it was sent to me directly, so maybe you couldn't see it.
No, I can't see nothing.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know why I can't see in chat.
Okay, I've just sent it to you.
Oh, thank you. I don't know why I can't see questions in chat.
I think it was because it was sent to me directly. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So female goddesses become yeah, about androgynous. I mean, you mean the I can understand the question. I mean, what do you want to know about? Also, it's
Olga, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry.
Basically, I'm asking, do you think that these changes in queenship and gender, the aggression of the female, is also associated with other changes, some of which are to do with aggression? For example, the increasingly separate and aggressive Eye of Ra, the increasingly androgynous female goddesses. There are one or two other things as well that all seem to happen from the early New Kingdom, although with a few precursors. I'm just wondering whether you see them as bound up, whether they're associated with one another.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Yes, I understand. So I don't think that it depends on this. No, I don't think that's it's connected with first of all religious like gods and goddesses and religious concepts, and for example, the idea of the masculinity and androgynous gods. No, I think so. And I would like to mention this, that the problem the main the changes, I mean, in women's possibility to become warrior leaders. So how's said, it's you know that the existence, for example, of powerful and brilliant goddesses in pantheon, or for example in ancient Egypt, on other regions of in ancient world. It doesn't mean that women in these regions, for example, they could be as well belligerent, could be more active, and the society could see them as more active, even if they have female goddesses in their pantheons. And we can see the same in China, for example, where in a very patriarchal society without any rights for women, they had a very active and powerful female goddesses. So I think that there is no connection with religious
you think the change was just a coincidence?
It's not like coincidence, but I suppose I think that all these cases of powerful women, they are exceptional, yes, and we have these cases in different periods of Egyptian history, and with the same pattern as I say, regency. And I can't see them, for example, I can see the connection with any change in, for example, in religious concepts, or even different ideology or something like that. It's quite interesting. For example, I read an idea that the militarization of the country leads to the women's oppression. So when the king emphasized his bellicosity, emphasized his military prowess more and more, women became less capable to gain power, to become a pharaoh, to become a king. And I suppose, and I think that it's not like accidentally, but it we have these cases because of the exceptional characters of these women and their political situation. So, when they came to power, because they were regents, and not depends. I think that it's not. I assume that it's not depends on any change in religious concepts, or even kinship, ideology of kinship or something like that. So first of all, it's militarization of the country, and the possibility for women. As I said, we can see it's very clearly with Queen Anhisenamun, even during the New Kingdom, even if there were cases of women in power like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, but she couldn't do that because she simply didn't have male heir. And for her, it was very, very difficult to become a ruler of Egypt.
So the next question we have is, would the reign of Nefertiti have had any bearing or influence on co-regency status?
You mean the reign of Nefertiti? You mean the reign of Nefertiti after the death of King Akhenaten? You mean the sole rule as a Nefertiti?
Maybe you can clarify that comment.
Yeah, because reign Nefertiti is mean co-regency with Akhenaten, or her sole rule as a pharaoh Nefer Neferuaten.
Or does the question mean the co-regency potentially of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun? Is that what you mean? I think that was you, Marie, was it?
You mean, I understand. So I understand that you mean that influence of Queen Nefertiti, Nefertiti's pattern of power on the regency of Ankhesenamun and Tutankhamun.
I think, but maybe if Marie is still there, you'll be able to clarify.
Yes,
if
so, yes, of course. Yes, of course. It's because, as I said, that Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun, they were born in Akhetaten and they grew up in Akhetaten, and then they moved Ankhesenamun was approximately 12 or maybe 13 years old, so she was not so young, and then she moved to Memphis, to Thebes and Memphis, and became a queen of Egypt. And of course, the only pattern of queenship she knew, it was the rule of her mother, Queen Nefertiti. And that's why for her it was absolutely natural to be a co-regent to her husband, because the same pattern of king-queen union was between her mother and her father, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, especially during the last years of the reign of Akhenaten. So that's why for them it was like, I think, very natural. And also we can see the influence of Nefertiti to the regency between Akhenaten, Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. So as I said, Ankhesenamun was not a typical queen consort.
So we have another question here is, are there any records and depictions that Nefertari had military activities? So that's the first part of the question.
Mm-hmm. So about Nefertari, no, we have only her participation in the scene of smiting the enemies. It's a very interesting thing that, because I said she's one of the 6 queens in Egyptian history who participate in such military and violent scenes. It's very unusual. And but as I knew, we don't have any any sources about her military activity. I'm going to study more deep. I mean, Queen Nefertari, to explain, to know more about the military activity of this queen. But as I knew, for now, no.
Just the one smiting scene? Just the one smiting scene, did you say?
Yeah.
Yep. The second part of the question is, what activities did queens of ancient Egypt usually perform in ordinary peaceful time? Did they participate in political activities?
First of all, we would like to say, what does it mean, political activities? And because I'm studying predominantly like military activity, and for example, international relationships. So it depends on the queen, as I said. So predominantly like queen consorts, they were not in military. They as a partner of kings, and they were involved in different religious rituals, and also accompanied king in different celebrations and religious celebration. And as you know, they couldn't do that by themselves. So like, for example, comparing to some Nubian queens, Egyptian queens couldn't do that. So they were absolutely predominantly, they accompanied their husbands or sons, and they couldn't act it independently, especially in like political activity. But we have some cases. It's very interesting. For example, Queen Tia, as I mentioned. So as I said, if you find military activity, military symbols of a queen, you know that she was involved in military activity, in a political activity. Because Tia, for example, she wrote letter to Tushratta, a king of Mitanni, and we know that some letters of Tushratta were sent to Queen Tia directly. So it was like international policy between Queen Tia and Tushratta at the time when King Akhenaten was on the throne. So he was a king of Egypt. But we have letter that was sent from King Tushratta to Queen Tia, not to King Akhenaten. So it means like a direct involvement on the military, on the political activity of the pharaoh.
Thank you for that. And Sam, do you have any questions?
Yeah,
I do. I've got 2 more questions, Olga, if you've got time to answer them. I know you've got a little one at home.
I'm confused. Sorry.
So the first question, if you've got time to answer it, is whether or not Egypt was a female discriminated country at the time, or were females treated equal as males? So not looking at the military, just in daily life, were men and women equal?
No, women and men were not equal, not in Egypt, not in other regions of any ancient East. It's a myth. They're all regions of ancient Near East. They're strictly patriarchal society. So it's very important to remember, especially when you see the ancient Egyptian art, when you see the literature, everything, you can see that it was absolutely patriarchal society, and women were perceived by men, and where we now see women through the men perception, and of course not equal. Maybe they have more rights than other women, for example, in other regions, yes, but equally not, of course not. And the question,
then the second question is about the Hittite prince. Do you think if perhaps they'd sent him straight away with a sizable escort with lots and lots of people with him, he might have had a better chance?
You mean if he sent Zananza, I mean immediately when he received
with lots of soldiers, do you think he would have made it, or do you think it was always destined
it's a very interesting question. You can't even imagine how often sometimes I ask this question. Really, yeah, I don't know exactly, but as I said, it was very difficult for the Egyptians to, I think, accept a Hittite prince on the Egyptian throne, because it was absolutely unprecedented. So I'm not sure. But as I said, for Queen Ankhesenamun, it was absolutely natural, and she just decided she was a ruler, and she decided just to have a Hittite prince as a king of Egypt, because she just didn't have any other options. But I'm not sure. It was very interesting, for example, about military support of Hittite in this situation, and I'm not sure that it could be possible. Really, it was very difficult, and maybe and how the Egyptian court, or for example, I don't know. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting question, but I still think that it was a dangerous affair, and I'm not sure that Zananza could have been a king of Egypt. But of course we don't know. Maybe if they acted very fast, and he sent Zananza very quickly after the first letter he received. And he sent a huge army with Zananza to Egypt, and they entered the Egypt. It's interesting question, but I don't know, sir, really. Sorry.
That's fab. Thank you so much. That's all the questions that have been sent to me, Ken.
Yeah, that's all that's going to come through to me as well. And
but
I think
lots of thank yous, lots of people saying it was a fantastic talk and how much they've enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Olga.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga, for a fantastic lecture. I hope everybody enjoyed it. The lecture was recorded, so we will be sending it to people who had booked tickets for the event. We'll be sending the email probably out tomorrow. So once again, Olga, thank you very much for a fantastic lecture, for being a brilliant volunteer at the Egypt Centre, and of course we wish you good luck with your PhD over the coming years, and look forward to maybe having you back for the Friends of the Egypt Centre, maybe when you've finished even your PhD, to give us more details about your results and what results you come up with.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you to everybody for attending tonight's lecture. As always, the support that you've given from the Egypt Centre over the past few years has been really fantastic. We rely on it a lot. Sam has posted some links into the chat in case you're interested in becoming a member of the Friends of the Egypt Centre and supporting the museum, as well as other events that we might have coming up. So if you follow our Eventbrite page, you will be able to see future events, including our next lecture, which is the 15th of June. And it will be by Sam herself, Sam Powell, who is now a PhD student at Birmingham University, and she'll be talking about wooden cast statues, including some that we have in the Egypt Centre collection. So thank you very much again to Olga, to Sam, and to everybody else for attending tonight's lecture, and hopefully see you all on the 15th of June. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.